Eric Clapton built his legacy on raw blues and fearless honesty.
And everyone turns to see this beautiful.
But sometimes, that honesty turned brutal, from walkouts mid-jam to public fallouts over lyrics.
There have been times in my past when I thought, well, I've got to pack this in because it's lonely. Not so hard. It's something that I've always dreaded doing because I don't think I had a fairly...
An agenda. I sometimes go to the studio and write on the floor, you know.
This is a no-holds-barred look at the top 12 rock legends Eric Clapton publicly slammed the most. Some names might seriously shock you. 1. Jimi Hendrix. It was supposed to be a friendly jam. Clapton, the reigning god of British blues guitar, invited Jimi Hendrix, then a largely unknown American import, to sit in during a Cream show at London's Polytechnic in 1966. Clapton had no idea the stage he was sharing was about to become a battlefield. Hendrix launched into a scorched earth version of Killing Floor, playing with a raw ferocity Clapton had never seen. As Hendrix shredded through impossible riffs, flipping the blues inside out, Clapton quietly left the stage mid-song, stunned and shaken. Backstage, witnesses say Clapton lit a cigarette with trembling hands, turning to his manager and muttering, "You never told me he was that F***ing good." That single performance shattered the British blues hierarchy overnight. Hendrix was wild, unrestrained, electric, a sharp contrast to Clapton's studied precision. In public, Clapton was respectful, but in private, sources say his admiration was laced with envy. His crown had been stolen, and the thief didn't even know it. The Hendrix-Clapton relationship remained strained. While both legends respected each other musically, Clapton often distanced himself from Hendrix's psychedelic theatrics, criticizing his showmanship as distracting from the music. It wasn't just about notes, it was about the changing tide of rock, and Clapton felt himself getting left behind. 2. Ginger Baker. If you want to understand Eric Clapton's most explosive feud, forget the rival guitarists. Look behind the kit, where Ginger Baker sat, fuming and ready to blow. Baker, the mercurial drummer of Cream, was as famous for his jazz-influenced drumming as he was for his volcanic temper. He once chased Jack Bruce with a knife. Clapton wasn't spared either. In fact, Ginger's unpredictable aggression nearly tore Cream apart multiple times. Their rehearsals were war zones. Baker would accuse Clapton of overplaying and trying to steal the spotlight. Clapton, in turn, was rattled by Baker's outbursts, once describing the experience as like walking on broken glass. On stage, the animosity turned physical. Baker would hit cymbals with extra force just to drown out Clapton's solos. If he missed a beat, it wasn't an accident, it was a message. Things got so bad Clapton considered quitting mid-tour. But the final straw came after Cream's farewell concerts in 1968. Baker wanted to continue, perhaps under a new name. Clapton flatly refused. He'd had enough of the shouting, the threats, and the toxic energy that seeped into every note they played together. Baker never forgave him. In later interviews, he took jabs at Clapton, saying, "He never understood how rhythm works." Clapton returned fire subtly, often omitting Baker from his recollections of musical heroes. 3. Jack Bruce. If Ginger Baker was the storm, Jack Bruce was the pressure system fueling it, and Clapton was stuck in the eye. While the world saw Cream as a supergroup of equals inside, it was a cold war between Bruce and Baker, with Clapton caught in the crossfire. But Clapton's own feud with Bruce was far less about theatrics and more about control, volume wars, musical clashing, and relentless one-upmanship on stage. Bruce was known for cranking his bass amp so loud it drowned out both Clapton's guitar and Baker's drums. It wasn't just accidental, it was territorial. Clapton, who believed in subtlety and tonal balance, often felt hijacked mid-performance. In some shows, he'd stop playing altogether, visibly frustrated. And when Clapton did speak up, Bruce wouldn't back down. He'd respond with sarcasm or worse, escalating the tension until it bled into their recordings. Clapton once admitted that by the time Cream recorded Wheels of Fire, he was emotionally numb, drained by the nonstop conflict. What began as admiration for Bruce's musical talent eventually curdled into creative suffocation. Clapton wanted unity, Bruce wanted dominance. Years after Cream disbanded, the animosity lingered. During reunion interviews, Bruce would subtly undercut Clapton, claiming he was never really a blues player. Clapton rarely responded, but when asked why Cream didn't last, he'd say, "Too much volume. Too many egos." For Eddie Van Halen, Eric Clapton helped invent the rock guitar god. Eddie Van Halen exploded it into a new dimension. When EVH arrived in the late 70s, his blistering finger-tapping style turned every previous generation of guitarist into background noise, including Clapton, and Eddie didn't exactly bow to the elders. In an interview with Guitar World, he admitted, "Clapton was great for his time, but he never evolved." That quote stung, because Clapton saw himself as a purist, not a relic. Clapton fired back, not with a headline, but through sarcasm and snubs. In one interview, he dismissed the whole shred scene as fast food for the ears, clearly lumping Eddie into the mix. Behind closed doors, mutual acquaintances reported that Clapton called Van Halen's playing soulless gymnastics. But this wasn't just generational rivalry. It was artistic philosophy. Clapton's blues was grounded in emotion, restraint, space. Eddie's style was about velocity, flair, sonic innovation. The divide between them was more than technical. It was spiritual. Their paths crossed a few times in Los Angeles circles, but never warmly. Van Halen, despite citing early Clapton as a childhood hero, grew increasingly cold toward his legacy. He'd praise Clapton's work with John Mayall or Cream, then say, "But after that, not much worth talking about." 5. Robert Cray. Few feuds in Clapton's life cut as deep, or came as unexpectedly, as his falling out with bluesman Robert Cray. Their friendship had spanned decades. Cray toured with Clapton, played festivals with him, and was often seen as one of the few younger artists Clapton truly respected. But everything unraveled in 2021, over a single email and a song lyric. Clapton had been publicly vocal about his stance on COVID-19 vaccines and lockdown mandates. When he collaborated with Van Morrison on the protest track Stand and Deliver, many saw it as political defiance. But Cray saw something else. One line, "You want to be a free man, or do you want to be a slave?" hit a nerve. To Cray, an African-American artist, the comparison of public health measures to slavery was not only tone-deaf, it was offensive. He wrote to Clapton expressing his concerns. Clapton replied, defending the lyric. What Cray hoped would be a dialogue turned into a severing of ties. He walked off the tour and publicly acknowledged the break, stating, "I couldn't defend it." Clapton, for his part, remained quiet, but his silence was telling. Friends turned into strangers over ideology. The rift wasn't about a policy. It was about perspective. Two bluesmen, bonded by shared stages and stories, fell out over the one topic neither could bend on. Clapton, deeply entrenched in his view, refused to apologize. Cray, equally anchored in principle, couldn't stay silent. 6. George Harrison. You don't win George Harrison's heart and expect no fallout, especially when you win it through his wife. Eric Clapton's most infamous feud wasn't really about music. It was about love, betrayal, and one of rock's most delicate heartbreaks. In the late 1960s, Clapton fell for Pattie Boyd, Harrison's wife and muse. Instead of hiding it, he poured it into Layla, a tortured masterpiece of obsession. Everyone in their circle knew who it was about, George included, but that wasn't the real betrayal. What broke the bond was Clapton's persistence. He openly declared his feelings, wrote her letters, and even turned to heroin as the emotional tug-of-war consumed him. Boyd eventually left Harrison in 1974 and married Clapton in 1979. But the damage had already been done. Although Harrison famously joked, "I don't care who she goes home with as long as I get to jam with him," their relationship cooled. Collaborations became strained. Clapton was disinvited from events. Tensions lingered for years, hidden behind polite interviews and forced smiles on stage. Behind the scenes, it was awkward. Friends were divided. Rumors swirled about passive-aggressive digs and lyrics. And when Clapton's marriage to Boyd collapsed in the late 80s, due to his drinking and infidelity, many saw it as poetic justice. 7. The Rolling Stones. Eric Clapton and the Rolling Stones shared many stages, but not always the same wavelength. Despite public collaborations and a shared love for blues, behind the scenes, Clapton's relationship with the Stones, particularly Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, was far from friendly. The early jabs came from Cream's camp. When asked about the Rolling Stones in interviews, Clapton once scoffed, "They were a Chuck Berry cover band with attitude." To Clapton, the Stones weren't real bluesmen. They were showmen, flashy, rebellious, but lacking depth. In one biting comment, Clapton allegedly said, "Tell them to learn to play, then come back to me." Ouch. Keith Richards, never one to let an insult go unpunished, fired back in his autobiography Life, calling Clapton a delicate player who talks like he's inventing something. The dig was clear. Clapton saw himself as the gatekeeper of authenticity. The Stones saw that as arrogance. But it wasn't just musical philosophy. Their personal lives overlapped in messy ways. Clapton dated Anita Pallenberg briefly, Keith's former partner. There were drugs, cross-party jealousy, and nights in the same bars trading smirks instead of greetings. Even in the 80s and 90s, when they were both elder statesmen of rock, that cool friction never quite thawed. Despite this, Clapton joined them on stage in 2012, playing Champagne and Reefer during their 50th anniversary tour. The performance was electric, but the smiles? Civil at best. 8. Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin may have become titans of rock, but to Eric Clapton, their beginnings were too calculated, too commercial, and maybe even a little phony. That's because Clapton had known Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones long before Zeppelin existed. They were London's go-to-session musicians, playing background parts on pop tracks in studio after studio. Clapton, already riding a wave of blues credibility with the Yardbirds and later Cream, reportedly looked down on Page's transition from anonymous sideman to guitar god. In one private conversation recounted by 1970s insiders, Clapton dismissed Zeppelin as studio boys pretending to be street fighters. That quote stuck. The resentment may have also stemmed from competition. Zeppelin exploded with a force Clapton couldn't match at the time. Their shows were louder, longer, and wildly more theatrical. Paige was burning guitars and bowing solos. Meanwhile, Clapton was clinging to blues purity. In some ways, Zeppelin made him look dated. There's even a rumor that when Clapton first heard Whole Lotta Love, he called it a bastardized blues track played like a circus. He hated the distortion, the bombast, the ego, and yet millions loved it. Zeppelin's rise marked the beginning of a new rock era, less about nuance, more about excess. Clapton never publicly condemned them, but the silence spoke volumes. He rarely covered their songs, never invited them to collaborate, and when asked in interviews, responded with vague praise or quick topic changes. 9. Jimmy Page. At first, Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton were brothers in arms, two British kids obsessed with the blues, rising through the same smoky London clubs. Page even replaced Clapton in the Yardbirds after Clapton's dramatic exit over their pop direction. For a while, there was mutual respect, but as Led Zeppelin soared into superstardom, that brotherhood started to curdle into something darker. Page's guitar wizardry turned him into a global icon. Stadiums roared. Records shattered charts. Meanwhile, Clapton's post-Cream projects, Blind Faith, Derek and the Dominoes, struggled to maintain momentum. What hurt Clapton most wasn't Page's success, but his reinvention of the blues. Where Clapton sought purity, Page turned the genre into epic fantasy. To Clapton, Zeppelin was showbiz. To Page, Clapton was a relic. The tension came to a head during the late 70s, when both were navigating personal demons, Page with heroin, Clapton with alcohol. They crossed paths often, but instead of camaraderie, there was frost. In one particularly shady moment, Clapton told a journalist, "Jimmy's too wrapped up in witchcraft and distortion." Page didn't retaliate publicly, but made sure their musical paths stayed separate. What should have been a guitar dream team never materialized. Clapton declined joint gigs. Collaborations were hinted at and ghosted, and while both attended mutual events, they were often seated far apart. 10. Keith Richards. Keith Richards once called Eric Clapton a friend when he's sober. That backhanded compliment was one of many jabs Richards lobbed over the decades, turning their rocky rapport into one of rock's most sarcastic feuds. The heart of the issue? Ego, drugs, and wildly different approaches to guitar. In the early days, Clapton saw Richards as a sloppy rhythm player, more style than substance. He preferred the technical precision of Jeff Beck or Jimmy Page. Richards, on the other hand, dismissed Clapton as a blues snob. During one backstage encounter, when Clapton criticized the Stones' sound, Richards reportedly snapped, "Go away and practice. Come back when you've got some soul." That one line circulated like wildfire, and Clapton never forgot it. Their barbs continued for years. Clapton accused the Stones of chasing fashion, while Richards called Clapton's solo career a borefest. Even when they appeared on the same lineups, they barely exchanged words. Richards once joked that inviting Clapton to jam was like asking a monk to dance. When Clapton heard the quote, he simply muttered, "Keith's still angry I stole his riff once." Despite all this, there were fleeting moments of civility. They performed together at charity gigs and memorial concerts, but the smiles looked strained. Interviews remained frosty, the jabs more surgical. 11. Roger Waters. In 1984, Clapton agreed to do something unusual. He joined someone else's tour. That someone was Pink Floyd's Roger Waters, promoting his solo album The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. On paper, it looked like a dream team. The cerebral architect of psychedelic rock, paired with the blues titan of British guitar. But behind the curtains, it was a mismatch waiting to combust. From the very first rehearsals, tension simmered. Clapton was laid back, instinctual, a player who thrived on feel. Waters, the opposite, hyper-controlling, intensely conceptual, and demanding down to the second. He wanted every note choreographed, every cue pre-programmed. For Clapton, it was stifling. According to insiders, Clapton bristled when Waters handed out binders detailing lighting cues, solo durations, and even facial expressions. One crew member recalled Clapton saying, "I'm not in a theater. I play music, not mime it." The final straw came midway through the tour. During a bus ride between shows, Waters allegedly snapped at Clapton over a missed transition. Clapton, cool but curt, stood up, walked to the front of the bus, and said, "I'm done after this leg." And he was. Waters downplayed the exit, citing scheduling. But Clapton later said he felt like a hired hand in someone else's opera. The split was permanent. Waters never invited him back. Clapton never mentioned Waters, without a sigh of regret or irritation. 12. Phil Collins. Not all of Clapton's feuds came from competition. Some came from collaboration. Enter Phil Collins, pop megastar, Genesis frontman, and the man behind the drums on some of Clapton's most commercially successful tracks in the 80s. But their partnership, while fruitful, slowly turned sour behind the studio glass. The two first clicked during Behind the Sun and August, albums that saw Clapton veering into a slicker, radio-friendly sound. Collins produced, played, and added polish. The album sold well, but critics were divided. And Clapton, he quietly hated them. Years later, he admitted in interviews that he was not proud of those records. He blamed the production style, Collins's signature-gated drums, glossy synths, and pristine layering, for stripping away his bluesy rawness. "It wasn't me," he said bluntly. Collins, for his part, was hurt. He claimed Clapton gave full creative control, then turned around and disowned the results. Their friendship cooled. Studio invites stopped coming. When asked if they'd work together again, Collins once said, "I don't think I'm his flavor anymore." The real burn came when Clapton began re-recording some of those tracks with a more stripped-down sound. No Collins, no synths, just blues. It was a message: I'm reclaiming my identity. From backstage blowouts and broken bandmates to silent standoffs with stadium legends, Eric Clapton's story isn't just about chords, it's about conflict. These weren't just musical disagreements. They were battles over style, ego, evolution, and identity. Some were personal, others were philosophical, but each feud helped shape the man behind the myth.